Okay, you're probably asking, why am I seeing Cooper right here? This is actually my 5th or 6th time trying to upload this video, and I'm convinced that it's something in the first 30 seconds that's the problem. I don't get told that, I'm just guessing. So please enjoy the next 15 seconds of us looking at my one-of-a-kind cult comic book. Okay, that should be good. I don't know what it was, but if you're seeing this, it means it worked. I'm gonna assume it wasn't working because maybe we have something in there that they actually don't want out. That all being said, let's get into it. I have been seeing so much content on Jeffrey Epstein lately, everyone's favorite New York financier. You know, the guy who everybody apparently loved at one point and was besties with, but now claim they don't know at all. However, looking past everything that's been popping up on this topic lately, I have noticed that above the milieu, there are 2 names that have stood out, that I think deserve a second look, especially as relates to Epstein. And those 2 names would be JonBenét Ramsey and Madeleine McCann. These are 2 names you've likely heard before, but not because they're Epstein co-conspirators, instead because they are 2 girls whose lives were stolen from them. In both of these girls' cases, I firmly believe there's a very real possibility Epstein and or his co-conspirators were involved in the ends they met, and whose cases deserve a second look with Epstein in mind. So let's start with the first of these 2 girls, and that would be JonBenét Ramsey. For each girl's case, I'm going to give some context to the story behind their disappearance or their demise, as well as aspects from the story that make no sense and were unaccounted for, that leave a lot of room for speculation. I will reiterate, these are my observations and research, and due to the apparent near complete corruption of law enforcement, until things are changed, these leads, although I think very obvious, and these bits of evidence very apparent, will likely never be followed up on until things change. JonBenét Ramsey's case is the one that shall begin us for today. JonBenét Ramsey is one of the most infamous missing child cases of all time. People likely recognize the name even if they're not familiar with the case, just because it sounds familiar, as the media reporting went insane for many years on it. And really, the media hype to this day still exists. It was an enormous story. So a very quick recap, or really as quick as I can make it. JonBenét Ramsey, or JonBenét Ramsey, was a 6-year-old girl from Boulder, Colorado, who from the outside was living the ideal life for any child. She seemed to be well loved, had a strong faith-based family, her parents were wealthy, and doted on her. She did child pageants, which I think we can almost all agree is really creepy. And locally, and to some scale beyond locally, JonBenét Ramsey was somewhat of a little celebrity, which is really creepy because she competed in pageants and did very well in them. And the whole thing seems so wrong, but at that time the family just considered it another feather in their cap, having a daughter who was winning in these high-ranking competitions. Some context out of the way, here we go. In the very early morning of December the 26th of 1996, around 5:30 a.m., JonBenét Ramsey's mom, Patsy Ramsey, reports her daughter missing to the police via the phone and that a ransom note has been discovered. This note delineated that $118,000 was the price of their daughter's return. An odd number, and really a small number considering how wealthy the family was, but it is also the exact number of her father's Christmas bonus that year. Unlike most ransom notes, however, it rambled on for almost 3 pages and was later found out to have contained lines taken directly from movies about kidnappings or that contained kidnappings. So already a bit odd. Even stranger though, when police arrive, they search the house and find nothing. Diddly squat, to be precise, as why would JonBenét Ramsey be in the house had she been kidnapped, as the letter stated. Continuing, after the police finish their search, they come back upstairs and tell John Ramsey, Joan's father, to search the home once again, knowing that he has a better idea of the layout of the home than they do. And upon that request, of all places, he decided to go directly down to the basement, and almost immediately finds the body in a room the police happen to miss. The room is described in initial reporting as being hidden, and that story has continued over the years, but the room is actually like directly in front of you as you go down the stairs. It's very hard to miss. JonBenét Ramsey, in this small room in the basement, is half covered by a blanket, and the body has been pretty obviously staged. At which point, for some reason entirely unknown, John Ramsey decides to pick up his daughter and then carries her upstairs, whereupon the horrified detectives, both at the fact this child's body is in his hands and at the destruction of evidence, tell John to put her down. He does, but not before the cops notice he's holding the body straight out like a spider he's trying to get rid of. I mean that very literally, and in fact rigor mortis had set in quickly, from what I understand, and JonBenét's whole body was rigid with her arms pointing straight upward. It's kind of a freaky image to imagine. An examination of Ramsey is done, and she is found with DNA all over her, especially in her under area, we're gonna call it, and inner thighs, and there is DNA found on the inner area of the inner thighs, we're gonna call it, as well as most of her body, like we said, and even on her clothes. Considering the sheer amount of DNA that was discovered, the cops should have figured out who had done it pretty quickly, but we're gonna see that's not the case at all. Later investigation shows that there's even saliva on the inner area of the thighs, which had been wiped down, along with some male-specific fluids, which had been destroyed or made untraceable, also by the wiping down of the body. But there was still some blood that remained, making it evident that the girl had been raped. Now, one would think that after learning that arguably the worst thing that could ever happen to a parent and their child had occurred, you would expect the family to be devastated. I mean, on the ground crying. I know I would be weeping. This would haunt me for literally ever. This would never leave my brain, and I'm sure we can all listening agree with that. However, in the case of John Ramsey, JonBenét Ramsey's dad, he and his wife seem deadpan, and he almost immediately gets on the phone with his private pilot and begins scheduling flights to get the rest of the family out of there. And like I said, Patsy Ramsey is not exactly as destroyed as one might think, and even in interviews later, she is very lacking in the emotion department, which begins a very strange pattern of behavior which will be better assessed in a video dedicated solely to this topic of JonBenét. So I'm going to fast forward to some of the unanswered questions that this case proposes. As mentioned, there was DNA found on JonBenét's body, and it was tested and then compared to everyone in the Benet family and their friends and their general circle, but there was no match among the results. So it wasn't anyone in the family or in their general circle. And for reference, the initial investigation by police tested some 160 people close to the Ramseys in their home. So for not to be any of them is pretty incredible, considering how well someone would have had to have known the Ramsey home to have made this possible without anyone being woken up in the middle of the night. In addition to that basic near impossibility, it's also very hard to balance the fact that the ransom note, when analyzed, had some disturbing realizations come from it. Number one, the unsub or unknown subject used stationery and a pen from within the Ramsey's home. Number two, the unsub was apparently so comfortable in this home that they were willing to not only write this massive letter, but they were willing to restart it after first addressing it incorrectly to Mr. and Miss Ramsey. That just didn't seem fitting enough for them. So I'm not kidding. That is right. There is actually a second partially written letter that was written first that was addressed to both parents. And the second one ended up just being addressed to John himself, the dad. And it's pretty clear that it takes quite a while to write a 2.5-page letter. So obviously whoever this is knows for some reason that they aren't going to get caught, because otherwise they are taking a huge risk after making all that noise with JonBenét, which leads many, including investigators, to believe one of the parents wrote the letter. And so obviously the feds run handwriting analysis, and it comes back as negative for John Ramsey, which was a sigh of relief for many. However, the same analysis was not able to rule out Patsy Ramsey, meaning in all likelihood she wrote the letter. And I don't say that just because she couldn't be ruled out, but for years they remained prime suspects. And just myself as a non-expert comparing the handwriting of this letter to Patsy's, I mean, you would have thought she was trying to make it look like she wrote this letter. It's hard to believe she didn't do it. At least from the way I look at it, let me know what you think down below. But if that's true, we have to ask a very strange question. If they wrote the letters, who did the actual attacking and mutilating of JonBenét Ramsey, as none of the family's DNA was on the child? And that sparks some very strange questions that the authorities, quote-unquote authorities, have never addressed. So now let's spread out and see who with child assaulting tendencies is operating in the Ramsey circle. And the first guy we have to look at is John Ramsey, the father, because he was and remains a disturbed bloke. He sort of came out of nowhere in the world of business. From the bits I found, he was college educated after being in the military, but had been reeling from several years of failed jobs and moving around the country with his first wife. And from what I've read, he was living off of money given to his first wife by her parents for quite a while. And eventually the two would get a divorce after they had had 3 children together. And Patsy would become his second wife and the mother of JonBenét. And once again, John Ramsey married into some money, as Patsy had come from a wealthier family. And so from the period of 1980 when John and Patsy got married onwards until 1989, very little is known about what John did, if he was really doing anything, until rather suddenly in 1989 he founded a company named Advanced Product Group, which dealt in early computer tech. He then combined his company with two others and formed Access Graphics. And Access Graphics was selling Sun Microsystems and was one of two licensed distributors of that technology, which is a huge deal. And why John was able to get this company off the ground, or why he was able to get this contract, was never explained. He has no tech history from what I can tell, and has no reason to be running this sort of company. But let's say there's nothing weird there. After these three companies come together, John runs it successfully enough that in 1991, Access Graphics was purchased by Lockheed Martin. I don't think I need to tell you guys that Lockheed Martin has been involved in all sorts of crap. I mean, that name is synonymous with scandal. And just putting it out there, why a military contractor bought Access Graphics was never really explained. John was now running Access Graphics, and by the end of the year 1996, Access Graphics had done over $1 billion in revenue, which is a crap load of money, especially in 1996. And in theory, it should have made John way wealthier than he said he was. And I think we get a hint at that by the fact he, one, lives in this enormous home, but also he does have a private pilot and is leading $1 billion corporation. Something's not mathing out here where he says just in a couple years after this case that he's broke and can't get a job. Continuing though, John went from zero to hero like crazy. He was published as being the Entrepreneur of the Year by the Boulder, Colorado Chamber of Commerce. He had an article praising his work published 5 days before his daughter's disappearance and then discovery in the basement. Like I said, he had gone from zero to hero. And so considering he had become so wealthy and prominent in the Colorado business world, but also in the business world at large, running such a large corporation, it should be no surprise that he did have a solid legal team. However, it's who John chose to go to that has caused so many people to ask questions over the years. And the name of the legal firm that John hired was Haddon, Morgan, and Foreman. To you and I, that name means nothing unless you're from Colorado, because in Colorado, it was and remains a power player. It's been described as a kingmaker in the world of leftist politics, even attributed as being a more powerful entity than the government of Colorado itself, and its clients range from governors to mayors to ultra-wealthy businessmen, and even socialites like, you know, Ghislaine Maxwell. As Ghislaine is in fact one of the more prominent clients of this company. And just to cover the bases, I am referring to the same Ghislaine Maxwell that is Epstein's co-conspirator. Now, first things first, we have to ask ourselves, why on earth would she have chosen this legal firm unless they had some strategic advantage, because she's from Britain and she lives halfway across the country in New York, where she already has access to the best legal firms. So why would she travel halfway across the country and choose what might be considered otherwise a more obscure legal firm, unless it has some sort of strategic advantage from people in her position? That's my only guess. With our current information, it just doesn't make sense. And so I've begun to speculate that this firm might be, let's call it, more willing to help people of such proclivities as a Ghislaine or a John Ramsey, as we'll see. As John Ramsey, at first, it seems makes sense why he would pick this firm, being a Colorado firm and a powerful one at that. But John Ramsey is a lifelong conservative, so one would anticipate that he would pick a firm that aligns with his persuasions instead of one that has constantly fought against what he believes, politically speaking. So it's also a weird choice for him. Moreover, one specific member of this law firm has been very active on behalf of Epstein's closest confidant, even going so far as to catalog throughout the night files Ghislaine was sending her from her home in New Hampshire the day before she was arrested. This, however, is not the only Epstein-related lawyer involved in the case. The vile little piggy Alan Dershowitz, who famously defended Trump, Harvey Weinstein, and, you know, Jeffrey Epstein himself in his original 2006 case where he was given a sweetheart deal by Alexander Costa, you know, the guy who was told Epstein belongs to intelligence and to leave him alone. Whew, sorry, I gotta catch my breath. That Alan Dershowitz, for no reason, makes himself very vocal during the Benet Ramsey case and says things to interviewers very, very, very early on that, quote, this may be one of those cases where the American public may have to be satisfied with the fact that there may never be a trial, which I find is a very odd thing to say, especially this early on in the case. And as the police are beginning to suspect that the parents themselves and those close to them are the ones that are involved in making this whole thing happen. Honestly, though, there are a number of these things, so I don't want to keep yapping for too long, going too far into the weeds, so let's just go right through. What the media doesn't report is that the DNA analysis shows that up to 6 people could have been involved in the of JonBenét, which is beginning to sound more like a ritual, and that she was, and I'm horrified to say this, passed around, which is disgusting. And considering that the mom, in my opinion, and that of handwriting observation and handwriting analysis likely wrote that note, I got to wonder what precisely they were doing, because the parents' DNA wasn't on that body, remember. And there is more to consider, as the connection between Ramsey, her family, and Epstein and co. might be way closer than we think, as there is a picture of JonBenét Ramsey, which was released as part of a Hulu series on her. It was supposed to be a brand new piece of evidence, and suspiciously, the date it was taken was never given to us. But based on the background though, and some of the outfits being worn, it appears to be a cold season, and Ramsey appears to be the oldest age she would reach, which would be about 6, meaning October or November or December of 1995, possibly even days or the day of her demise. The date, I will once again say, is complete speculation though, as once again, no date was given to us in this information release. The photo on screen now though is the one in question, in which we see a joyful child, an innocent soul, and virtually everything in this image appears to be normal. It's a photo that was taken at some sort of party, maybe even the very Christmas party on December 23rd, or some of the other ones that the Ramseys went to. However, upon a second look, if you take a closer look at the background towards the left half of the screen, you're going to pretty quickly spot a demon. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this photo, you might be confused what I mean, and so I'm going to zoom in. And the demon, as I call it, is right there on the left side of the screen, just ever so slightly in frame. And if you recognize that figure, it may be because I and many others believe it's very likely Ghislaine Maxwell. And I would be willing to bet it is, because the resemblance is so uncanny. A series of photos of her from the 1990s show a similar haircut, color, and length, as well as the obvious that the jaw structure and eyes are as close to identical as I can imagine, to the point that if it weren't her, I would be gobstruck and would be willing to believe Ghislaine has an identical twin or doppelganger that we didn't know about until right now. And if that is Ghislaine in the background, then I think the following idea gains some merit. It's clear at this point that what's been happening with Epstein and that whole ring wasn't merely for the sake of hedonism and fulfilling one's most evil desires, or even just for blackmail. There is this spiritual element to it, and a desire to serve evil for evil's sake and to do evil for evil's sake. If this sounds crazy, pause and look up the thing in the term on screen now, because there's a word for what I'm discussing. But this word and what it leads to is kind of the end of what really is behind occultism, which Epstein was so clearly steeped in. It's this doing of evil for evil's sake in order to bring about greater evil. And in that regard, there is nothing more reviled than doing to a child what was done to JonBenét. So yes, I am suggesting that what happened to JonBenét was possibly something of ritual sorts. Not like a witch with her brew pot in the woods speaking incantations, but something a little bit different than that we don't quite understand. On that line, the entire case is filled with evil and cover up at a massive scale. For instance, a grand jury was convened to investigate the case in the 1990s, and they came to the conclusion in 1999 that John and Patsy Ramsey must be indicted on child endangerment resulting in death, which would have forced them to go to trial and have to defend themselves and would have given us way more answers. But the judge at that time struck it down, claiming there was insufficient evidence, which if there was a case with enough evidence for an indictment, it would be this one, let's be honest. And even worse than that, this was hidden from the public for about a decade, and no one except for the grand jury, the judge, and some in law enforcement were aware that the grand jury had requested an indictment. Further, even the feds who investigated this were widely under the impression the parents were in on it somehow. And so I do suggest that at minimum the parents were involved. I think that's a pretty fair thing to suggest. I also proffer the notion that we have opened our minds quite a bit more by 2026 to these alternate lanes of thinking, especially compared to 1996, when Epstein-like rings were believed by most to be conspiracy theories. Obviously, we know better than that now. However, most people who don't look into this stuff think that a JonBenét Ramsey type case only happens once in a couple of decades, or maybe even once in every few decades, but that simply isn't true. Little girls and boys for that matter end up like JonBenét far too often and get none of the attention she does. Even within Epstein circles, we will likely not ever know the names of half the victims, if they even had names, and their bodies have long since been disintegrated. That said, there are some other things that lead me down this Epstein train of thought that happened with the Benét family in the days prior to the body's discovery. Someone the evening of December 23rd picked up the Ramseys' home phone line and dialed 911, and upon the operator picking up, the person hung up without saying a word, which was never explained, neither who placed the call nor why they called. It's all a total unknown. But as is required, a cop went and ensured that everything was okay at the home, and instead of going in, he trusted their word that it was an accident. Who knows what was going on there? Was it JonBenét? Was it her brother? Was it someone who grew a conscience? No one knows. What I do know is that the night she passed away around midnight to 2 a.m., the Ramseys' next door neighbor, through the Ramseys' home, into her home, was able to hear a very loud scream that lasted 3 to 5 seconds, which seemed to come from the lower floors of the Ramseys' house. And the neighbor even noted that she thought a kid might have been injured. But after the scream stopped and she didn't hear anything else, she fell back asleep. The police seem to have not followed up there either. Obviously though, considering that the neighbor believed and pointed to the Ramseys' house as the source of the screaming, there is no reason the parents shouldn't have heard it and gone searching for their daughter and what was going on. That would be, however, unless the parents were in on it. Furthermore, the window the perpetrator allegedly came through in the basement, which was how the Ramseys explained the perpetrator got in, not only had no footprints surrounding it in the snow, and there hadn't been more snow to cover them up, the windows were also covered in cobwebs on the inside that were completely undisturbed, meaning someone could not have gone through there without it being obvious based on these cobwebs. And Star News reports at this time that large sums of child pornography had been downloaded onto Access Graphics computers. That was John Ramsey's company. Reporting at the Times also states that there were pornography tapes found in John Ramsey's office. Furthermore, Don Cyril Weicht, I definitely didn't pronounce that name right, suggests that JonBenét had been more than just on that day, and that had she been taken to the emergency room at some point for an injury and the doctors had reason to check her lower areas, they would have immediately arrested the father, as her lower area was roughly twice the size of what it should be for a girl her age. In John Ramsey's office, the police also found an instructional video on how to use a stun gun. The video hasn't been released. The reports I have read, though, imply, really they state, that it's how a stun gun can be used to elicit responses, like desired responses. Take that in all directions, both mental and physical responses. I've heard it described as how to make a mind slave with a stun gun. This video was purchased from a supply store, or so we think, because John Ramsey claims it was an advertisement that had been thrown in his bag or something like that, and he didn't know that he had it, but I don't think anyone actually believes that. It's worth bringing up though, not just because it's weird, but because, as is a deep topic of debate, people believe that there were two separate sets of what appear to be stun gun marks on JonBenét's body that were never explained by the authorities, but would make sense based on this videotape that was discovered, which leads many to believe that Dad was trying out what he had learned on this videotape, and also would explain why the neighbor could hear a scream from inside her home. I mean, if I was being repeatedly tased, you'd probably be able to hear screams from other people's houses as well. And so we have faked crime scenes, child torture, sacrifice, porn, and photos with possibly Ghislaine Maxwell and the victim in the background. Sounds like the making of some of Epstein's best buddies. A wealthy, powerful, business-oriented family in the up-and-coming industry of technology in the 1990s with a Christian veneer, perceivably with a great family, and yet they are internally hiding a deep evil. That said, JonBenét is not the only Ramsey daughter to die horribly and mysteriously. John Ramsey's 22-year-old daughter died in a mysterious car crash with her boyfriend a few years before JonBenét's demise. And I'll put it this way, considering it's very likely that JonBenét had been experiencing terrible things before her terrible end. Many have described JonBenét's older sister and her father as being very close. What those words mean is up to you. The police also almost immediately asked for a copy of those records as well, clearly suspicious of something, but unsurprisingly those records are very barren. As the story goes, it was a slippery road and the car went erratically out of control. Why that happened, no one knows. But it's not a great look when both of your daughters die in mysterious ways and you have videos describing how to engage in torture with a stun gun. We've also got Ramsey scheduling this flight to try and get away the same day he finds out what happened to his daughter. It's all too much for me to look past. And I would also like to suggest, if you've already done 160 DNA tests, I don't think it would hurt to try testing 2 more people, that being Epstein and Ghislaine, because it's very possible that at least one of their DNA is on this girl, as there's just something so uncanny about all the facts surrounding this case and the bizarre end she met that matches up so well with an Epstein-like victim. And so, say this doesn't convince you totally, which is fair. A lot of it is speculation or circumstantial. I ask you to simply turn your gaze to Epstein's house, a place I would actually cut off limbs before entering during his lifetime. However, say you and a friend were to stroll down the halls of his elegant New York manor and glance to and fro at the walls, and you all took a pause in just the right spot, your jaws would drop to the floor and go right through it when you saw this framed photo. It's beautiful, right? The deep black square work is just excellent. Jokes aside, it's ludicrous this photo is being hidden, as it hides countless secrets. First things first though, it's funny because the mainstream slopaganda has claimed this is Epstein's niece behind the black square, But if that were the case, why did they cover her face, as she's out there and discoverable and researchable and over the age of 18 and not a victim, so you're not protecting a minor according to the feds or a victim. So obviously this whole niece story falls apart, so let's instead look for another reason why this might be going on. And the only reason I can see to hide this face is if it belongs to someone in an ongoing investigation, and or the government doesn't want a public link between Epstein and the girl in this photo, because it would completely break the system if true. Before I get ahead of myself though, if we were to take the niece story and for some reason they thought they needed to cover her face, it still wouldn't make sense, because then why did they cover her feet and the bottom half of her legs with a black square? That seems like a very strange thing to redact in my opinion. Unless perhaps the bottom half of the legs and these shoes would also give away too much information as to who might actually be behind these black redaction squares. It's very hard to go beyond this, because after all, these are just black squares covering all the information we would need to make a decision, right? Fortunately for us, however, both AI detection software and federal agents these days are basically just village bumpkins. One, because they're still serving the system that defends Epstein, and two, because in another photo down the hall, pointing backwards, we can see the photo on the wall from a very harsh angle, which was enough for the AI software to not notice the face and that it wasn't covered. But it is, however, enough for us to see a smidgen of the girl's face still, which we will get to shortly. Because first things first, when trying to date this image, we have to compare Epstein's face in it to him over the years. And after a short while, we can see that the hair color, hairstyle, face complexion, and structure align very nicely with Epstein of the mid-1990s. And if we zoom in on the girl wearing the jumper on Epstein's shoulders, it becomes very apparent that it's an uncannily similar one to the jumper that JonBenét loved wearing and was likely her favorite or one of her favorite outfits. Which is odd, you know, what a coincidence, right? If you believe in those. And then now looking closely where the legs and shoes are unredacted, it also seems to match what JonBenét would have worn. And so now let's scooch up the zoom a bit and finally zoom in on the face. And oh wow, from what we can see, it's a little girl with white skin around the age of 6 that looks exactly like JonBenét Ramsey, as my eyes see it, that is. And I might suggest that from my perspective, that's probably because it is JonBenét Ramsey. Supposedly, allegedly, maybe by happenstance, of course. That's right though, from what I can tell, Epstein has a picture of Ramsey on his shoulders on the wall. Perhaps this is to celebrate his favorite of what he might consider a conquest. Perhaps it's to satisfy his frankest urges. But that would be a rabbit hole for another time. Really quickly got a break in here. I learned actually after editing this that the government took down the unredacted version of this photo and then uploaded a redacted version on top of it after it came out that there was an unredacted photo of what appears to be JonBenét Ramsey. So I think that only makes him look more guilty. In my opinion, let me know what you think down below. Out of the way, let's get back to the video. Madeleine McCann. This is a case I plan to do a dive into at some point. She was the daughter of 2 British doctors, and as such, Madeleine McCann was promised a well-appointed childhood and a blessed life. And this one hits home for me in a strange way, because Madeleine McCann was born on my birthday in the same year of 2003, that being May 12th. So we would both be the exact same age today. However, on May 3rd, 9 days before her 4th birthday, in 2007, her family was vacationing with 7 other friends who also had children. There were 3 couples present, and there was 1 mom of one of these couples present. From the outside, all signs pointed to a wonderful trip for the families to Praia de Luz, Portugal, a beautiful place. The families had rented their own accommodations, which for the McCanns was an apartment in a nicer area of town. Down the street from the apartment in this same general complex, several hundred yards away, there was a restaurant. And on the night of May the 3rd of 2007, Madeleine McCann's parents and the other 3 couples and one of the couple's moms went to dinner. When she realized she was alone, she had to cry herself to sleep, which she really did not like. And we know this because Madeleine McCann, the next morning after this event, which was the morning of her disappearance, cried and asked her parents why they had left her alone last night when she was crying and looking for them, which spawned the terrible idea of checking in on the kids every 30 to 40 minutes, because evidently 30 minutes isn't enough for something to go wrong in their eyes. Yap aside, the night of her disappearance, Madeleine was supposedly checked in on every 30 to 40 minutes by one of the 9 adults who are responsible for checking in on all the other children. Madeleine was noted as being fine during all of those checkups, and this was unsurprising, presumably to the McCanns, as they had taken the time to secure the window in the room where Madeleine was sleeping with the other twins. And after bedtime stories were read and the children were tucked in, the parents, they should go out and head to the restaurant because there was nothing amiss, right? Before doing so, though, they left the front door of their ground floor apartment in a foreign country cracked open so the kids could be checked in on easier. There's some stupid excuse like that. And it would not be until hours later, after the parents had left, that Kate McCann's turn was up to check in on all the kids. And upon arriving, Kate noticed something was wrong. The front door was open a little wide and the curtains were billowing in the wind. And here, I'm not gonna go any further into Kate's testimony, as based on her behavior thus far and what we're gonna see later, she is as untrustworthy as they come. The list of reasons, however, is for another video, so for now we're going to cut back to a handful of minutes later when Kate reappears at the restaurant and says, of all things, quote, they've taken her. I'll repeat it one more time, quote, they've taken her. Maybe that did or did not strike your ears as a little bizarre, but if it didn't, it should, because if you have a child in the walking phase who misses you, when you go to get tipsy with your buddies and leave her alone, and you also leave the apartment door open, logic might suggest several things before you assume that she's been taken. For instance, maybe she walked off seeking her negligent parents for comfort after a bad dream. As we know, the night before, she had woken up and had been crying looking for her parents. Also, Madeleine McCann is in the peak age for when sleepwalking occurs with kids, and so she could have easily accidentally left the door without realizing and been somewhere in this neighborhood complex area. But from what we are aware of, Madeleine McCann's mom did very little searching before returning to the restaurant. And some other options of what could have happened are that she was hiding somewhere in the house, scared from a nightmare, and that her parents weren't home, and so when someone came in, Madeleine was scared that they might be angry at her, or scared because she didn't know it was her mom, and so she hid further in so no one could find her. So to jump to the conclusion of kidnapping immediately is kind of ludicrous, but it's not just that. Let's say she had reason to think instantly that Madeleine was kidnapped. Let's go back and analyze that specific statement that Kate used to tell everyone at the restaurant what had happened. Words that had been corroborated by many sources. Kate McCann said, quote, they've taken her. Like many, when I hear this, I hear an implication of familiarity with that they, because otherwise, Kate would have been yelling something like, she's been taken, or someone took her, or really, what she should have been yelling because she doesn't know or really have reason to believe her daughter was kidnapped is, Madeleine is missing. This is just one of 1,000 things wrong with what is going on here. I'll quickly mention that bloodstains were found inside the home that had been covered up and tried to be cleaned up, and they were only found because a world-class cadaver dog had spotted it behind the couch. We also have reason to believe that the McCanns had been sedating their children, so two not normal things already are occurring, and we get further idea of this because why didn't the twins wake up if someone had taken Madeleine? But to the importance of our discussion, the night of Madeleine's disappearance, one of the McCann's friends who was responsible for the 9 o'clock check-in, her name is Jane Tanner, while walking back to the restaurant around 9:05 started a convo with another British vacationeer, and while chatting around 9:15 p.m. noticed a man carrying a child in his arms away from the McCann's apartment. The child was laid out across the arms in a manner one might carry a small sleeping child, or more probably a deceased child, and the man doing said carrying went hurriedly by. And despite all the signs this is something that should be paid attention to, Tanner ignored the situation and allowed the passerby to pass by, noting the outfit and even the hair color, but somehow not seeing the face, or at least not to what she says. And the sketch is on screen now. This sighting is one of several, and it's particularly strange because no one can actually pin down Jane Tanner's having been there or these other people having been there at the same time in the street where it occurred, because it's a super tight, almost alleyway-like pass-through, and people should have seen one another without issue. And it should have been very easy to get a good look at someone's face. And so it's one of dozens of strange things that have occurred and stemmed from that evening, and with all the lies that have been told, it's very difficult to tell what is real and what isn't. However, it's worth noting that the child being carried is reported as having been wearing a similar bedclothes to Madeleine, and as such, it should have been a huge red flag for someone who claims to be a family friend. They should have gone up there and stopped this person, or at least gotten a good look to see if it was Madeleine or not. Other reports would later emerge over the ensuing months and years of people who had also spotted a Madeleine-aged and dressed girl in the arms of different adults seeking to hide that child, which was in their possession. And like I said, the context is important, but getting too into the woods won't do us much good here, so I'll leave the case details there. In the wake of Operation Grange, which is the case name for the Madeleine McCann investigation, which is arguably the most widely reported in missing children's investigation in history, some sketches have been released. And I'm going to show some of them to you on screen now. Not all these faces are going to look familiar to you, nor should they, but I can think of 3 on here that definitely should be familiar. And I'm going to give you a couple seconds and you can think about who you might suspect these faces to belong to, and then I'm going to show you who I think they are. Okay, I've given you like 10-ish seconds, so now I'm gonna attach these sketches to the faces and the people that are widely believed this side of the internet to be the owners of these faces in the sketches. And that would be the Podesta brothers, who we have a series on, and Ghislaine Maxwell. The resemblance is uncanny to the point it's actually just kind of creepy. But what's more creepy is that to this day, no one has ever actually investigated any of these people or their connections to the disappearance of this girl. It has gone undiscussed and has been labeled a conspiracy theory that people don't like to get into in official capacities. I wonder why that might be. There are so many other things that happen in this case that make me think it's connected to something higher up and then a cover-up is going on. For instance, you have the coming in and saying that the Portuguese authorities are backwater and don't know what they're doing. This last one is a big point of contention in the debate over this topic and what happened, because the Portuguese government is pretty firmly on the side that the parents did this and were involved. And for whatever reason, the British government just completely rejects that. I will note that Ghislaine Maxwell is British and is a very powerful individual. And Epstein also exerts control in British government and politics. And the British government and royal family is no stranger to people who enjoy the touching of kids. So why they came out so strong against the Portuguese government and investigators, especially as they started finding things like bloodstains in the house, might make more sense with that in mind. And then you've also got the strange case of a fellow named Clement Freud, who is the grandchild of, Sigmund Freud, a character in and of himself in this regard. And Clement was, for whatever reason, in Portugal at the time of Madeleine's disappearance, and invited the McCann parents over many times to hang out and have dinner. And they became very close friends. Kind of just a weird thing to insert yourself into, I guess, but really weird considering that Clement is a pedophile and has been accused of many people as having diddied them. So now we've got these people who are suspected in their daughter's demise hanging out with a pedophile. And they've got a bunch of sketches from the crime of people who are famously known as being pedophiles, possibly having been involved in this abduction. And then to add another thing, all sorts of corruption happened in the ensuing years. You've got the McCanns paying their mortgage from the money donated for the search for their daughter. You got them selling a book, like show rights to create content about their daughter, which they made money from. Needless to say, there's been all sorts of strange things that have happened, but what sort of fits really nicely with someone who's possibly connected to an Epstein-like figure or his co-conspirators is what Madeleine McCann's mom would end up writing in her book that came out about her daughter. There are a lot of bizarre things she wrote that shouldn't be in there. There are long discussions of her sex life with her husband and how they were struggling to do it after this disappearance, which she says at the beginning she would never talk about and then talks about for paragraphs. So that's weird. But what many people have pointed out and really calls into question what the parents were up to is this line, and it goes as follows. I'm reading verbatim, by the way. I asked Jerry apprehensively if he had any real horrible thoughts or visions of Madeleine. He nodded. Haltingly, I told him about the awful pictures that scrolled through my head of her body, her perfect little torn apart. And I think if I have to say why that's creepy, then we might have a problem here. That all being said, as it relates to Madeleine McCann, when you have sketches of people who look identical to known traffickers and pedophiles involved in the disappearance of your child, that would have been the first place I would have looked, but evidently they didn't. And unsurprisingly, that angle was never investigated like we talked about. As relates to Madeleine McCann, there's also some Epstein files related information, including tips coming into the FBI about how Madeleine McCann's abductors matched Ghislaine and the Podesta brothers so well. It's also rumored that the Podesta brothers had a home in Portugal in this area at that time. That is very hard to confirm. However, we do know that at one point they did have a home in that exact same area and would have been familiar with it. And Ghislaine is a global traveler, so it's no surprise if she were there. I really want to say thank you guys so much for watching. It really does mean a lot, and I'm super grateful. I hope you enjoyed the video and hope you thought this was interesting. I've seen the theories floating around online about Epstein and his co-conspirators' involvement in these cases, so I thought, why not go all the way and see if we can find if there's some truth to that. And I went into it very curious, and I honestly wasn't that surprised if they were involved, and I left pretty much convinced they are. Not 100%, the security camera footage from that night. Speaking of, for Madeleine's case, there was actually a camera on that road where there was that Jane Tanner sighting. And suddenly, for some odd and unknown reason, the authorities can never get that footage, but who knows.
Carrying the child walked down this road.
Which is where the McCann's apartment was up there.
Exactly, the McCann's apartment was located there. Mm-hmm. What he was furious about is that this security camera, which we can see on the corner here, his officers had never found.
So this one here that we see just in front
this
of
one
the
here,
orange block.
Exactly, and he believes that was absolutely critical, and he was furious that his officers never found that camera. They never located it.
And when he found the camera, it was
too late.
There are so many different things that are going on with these cases, and I'm sure that these two are not the only ones that you can connect Epstein to, or his co-conspirators. So with that in mind, I ask you guys to definitely let me know if there's anyone else I should look into on this, and let me know what your thoughts are, and if you think he's involved, or if you think it's just a coincidence, and it's all just a conspiracy theory. At the end of the day though, no matter what, these are still two children who lost their lives in horrible ways. I also hope you guys are staying safe out there yourselves, because the world appears to be getting much, much crazier, much faster. That all being said, thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate all you guys, and I can't wait to see each and every one of y'all in the next one.